Now we're starting Charley Skedaddle, Chapter 8, The Rebs, on page 85. The boy did as he was told. Looking from face to face, he was relieved to see no one he knew. He took the handful of skillet parched corn a Reb had given him, and he tried to chew it. He couldn't, and he had to spit it out. Rebel soldiers watched him and laughed. One said, "It's what we got to eat. Ain't it good enough for you, Yankee brat?" A rebel officer in a very tattered, soiled gray coat came over to the prisoners to warn. "Don't you Union men do any talking to one another. I'll personally shoot the man who does. Someone will be coming to get you soon." His words proved true. Very shortly, 3 Confederate soldiers with muskets and shining bayonets came to rouse the Yankees up and send them walking on ahead of them. An hour's marching of nearly 3 miles brought Charley and the others through the wilderness to a large open space where they once again were told to sit. There was a farmhouse, a barn, and some other outbuildings here, as well as hundreds of shabbily dressed Confederate soldiers. More were gaunt and grimy. Not a few were shoeless. Some wore gray forage caps. Others wore brown slouch hats over a mixture of gray and butternut brown jackets and coats. And some had on Union blue trousers, stripped from the enemy dead. White smoke from the muskets firing among the trees mingled with the darker smoke from the wilderness fires. Coming across the open space, the acrid-smelling wreaths, it made men cough and sneeze. Charley put the handkerchief up over his nose and mouth again. The boy was just settling himself onto the ground when he was forced to leap up to his feet to keep from run over by a host of men who were racing toward him. Rebels! Rebels retreating as fast as they could. And then a great animal-like roar rose up from 1,000 throats. And Charley saw other tattered rebels racing forward toward the ranks of their retreating comrades. A charge. And as they ran, they screeched the famous rebel yell, "Yee!" And behind them came a tall, gray-bearded officer and a gray uniform under the black cloak, riding a dapple-gray horse with a black mane and tail. As the officer reached the charging men, a few of them, hearing the hoofbeats, slackened their speed. At once, a wild shouting rose up from these men. "Go back, General Lee! Go back!" Lee? Robert E. Lee? Charley Quinn gaped in amazement, as did the other prisoners. Generals were seldom seen anywhere, and certainly not in infantry charges. Charley watched, fascinated, as a sergeant of the charging Texas Brigade sprang toward to grab hold of the bridle of Lee's horse, stopping the famous traveler from going into battle with his master. Now many Texans halted their attack to turn and shout, "We won't go back unless you go back!" A Confederate officer rode up to Lee's side and began to argue with him. When Lee slowly shook his head, the sergeant let go of the rein to release it to his commander-in-chief. An enormous cheer crashed into the smoky air as Robert E. Lee turned his horse around and began to ride toward some horsemen and a knoll to his right. "Lee! Lee!" echoed soldiers' deep voices, and while their comrades cheered, those men of the Texas Brigade who had forced Lee back to safety resumed their charge against the Yankees among the trees. As for Charley Quinn, he sat down again at a bayonet's prod until a corporal came over, pointed to him, and then jerked him to his feet. Hustled along, he was taken to a tent where a sad-faced, balding Confederate officer sat at a little folding table. It was hot inside, and in front of the rear tents were flapped open for ventilation. Once the corporal had gone, the officer asked, "Who are you, lad?" Charley Skedaddle." "I know that word, and I doubt that is your real last name." Charley swallowed and said, "It's Quinn, sir." "You're not a soldier, are you?" "No, sir. I never signed any papers to enlist. I was only a drummer." At this, the officer put down the pen he had in his hand. "A drummer boy. I thought as much. What is your age?" "12, sir." "What is your regiment?" Charley didn't answer. All soldiers had been warned that if they were ever captured, they were to tell only their name and rank. He had done that already, and now he said, "I can't tell you that, sir." The officer smiled slightly. "Have you ever gone to school?" "Oh, yes, sir. I can read and write just dandy." "I'm glad to hear it. I was a schoolmaster at one time." He sighed. "How'd you get separated from your regiment? I think you could tell me that, you know." Blushing, Charley lowered his gaze. He stuttered, "Oh, I got scared when I saw my drum hit by a minute ball, and I saw my friend Jem get killed. So I ran away." Mother Mary, no. He wouldn't dare say that he picked up a musket and killed a Reb. Now that'd bring him more trouble for sure. "So you ran away. I thought you had. Well, you're only a child after all. Have you ever heard of Andersonville prison?" "No, sir, I haven't." The Confederate officer sighed again. "It's a prison camp for Yankee soldiers down in Georgia. It'd be a very bad place to send a boy your age. I should be in a classroom. If any of the men from you should be in a classroom. If any of the men from your regiment in Andersonville found out you were a deserter, it would be even worse for you." "Well then, I think I shall have to do something else with you. You'll note that I have not written down one word about you. I'll have no record of you." "What do you do with me, sir?" "Have you any money with you?" "A little bit." "Good. Yankee money's worth quite a bit more here than our money. You see the open tent flap behind me?" "Yes, sir, I do." "Then be so good, Charley Skedaddle, as to skedaddle through it right now. As I see it, you are of no use to us, and I don't want it to be on my conscience that I sent a 12-year-old boy to Andersonville." "You're letting me go." "Yes, I am. There's a thicket of some size behind his tent. Get into it and stay there until this battle's over and we move on." "But where will I go after that, sir?" "Well, that's up to you. If you go north, you'll run into your own troops. If you go south, you'll be captured again and may fare differently with some other man. If you go east, you could run into battle after battle. And that's where the fighting is going next, unless I miss my guess. What's left to you then?" "The West?" Charley, unable to believe his good fortune. "Then west it has to be. That's mountain country here in Virginia. You'll find it very different from New York City. But I see it as your only refuge right now." Charley gasped out, "How did you know I was from New York City?" "Your manner of speaking and how you pronounce words. I've been there. I've made a study of accents. That's why I was given this particular chore with prisoners who will not talk. Get rid of your uniform if you know what's good for you. Now, my boy, do as I tell you. Skedaddle before I change your mind. I don't fancy deserters, no matter how young they may be." "Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir." After lifting his hat, Charley Quinn shot like a bolt past the man's table and out the rear flap of the tent. He sprinted for a nearby hickory thicket and dived inside, all the while thanking the guardian angels and the sisters that he always had with him for his deliverance. Once inside the thicket, he took off his blue uniform blouse, discarded his cap, and began to pick at the stripe sewn along the sides of his trousers as part of his splendid drummer boy's uniform. Lying on his belly in the thicket on that long, hot day, Charley had a lot of time to think and wonder, and the heat of shame crept up into his cheeks as the thoughts of Silas and Jem. They had not run. They had fought it out. Had Silas died too? What had happened to the 140th? Where were they now? Still fighting here in the wilderness? Were most of them dead, as his friends were? Would Noreen get a letter from someone in the 140th telling her that he had run away, or worse, or whoever wrote her to be kind of say he was missing in action. Perhaps even mentioned that he'd been picked up by a musket, or he had used it. Used a musket. Yes. Each time he closed his eyes, Charley could see the man he had shot and killed. Mother Mary, he had committed a mortal sin. He wasn't a real soldier who had orders to do that to an enemy. Where could he confess his sin? Where could he find a priest? He should have gone back to the rear of his regiment and halted there, ready to be captured. Or he should have tried to get a new drum from the supply wagon. If he had done that, he wouldn't be caught in this nightmare now. But he hadn't. He'd killed a man. And then he'd run and kept on running. Now look at him. He was no longer in any uniform at all. And he was alone and nameless in a thicket somewhere in the dreaded wilderness. The fight went on and on till sunset. And while it did, Charley laid in his thicket, afraid to move lest he be discovered. Insects crawled over him, and once a brown-bodied little snake twisted by. Not 3 feet from his motionless hand. Oh, how did he ever find himself in this vile place? Why did he ever leave the Bowery? Sweet Mother of God, how he missed New York. How he wished he were back in the Bowery among his friends. He'd give anything to be with Noreen. He'd even be glad to see Mr. Demarest. They would find him different now. They would. He would even give up his membership in the Bowery Boys if Noreen wanted. Dozens of thoughts of recriminations, all of them sad or frightening, went through Charley's head as he lay there until finally, worn out by anguish, fear, and hunger, he fell asleep, his face pressed to the red soil. And while he slept, the battle of the wilderness slowed and then petered out in the darkness.